Okay, Diane, over to you.
Good evening. My name is Diane Allen, and I am the moderator for this evening, and I am happy to introduce our speaker for today. And the topic is the future of NATO and European security. And our speaker is led by Rose Gottmuller, the William J. Perry Lecturer in Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Her previous positions include Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2016 to 2019 and Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. And I'll let her begin. Thank you, Rose.
Thank you. Thank you, Diane. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm very glad to be here with you tonight. It's just about a year ago when I appeared the last time, and perhaps I was a little optimistic at the time about the course of the war in Ukraine. Unfortunately, the past year has been a sad story from that perspective, and we had a very the nicest thing I can say is a tumultuous event on Friday when the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, was at the White House in the Oval Office with President Trump and Vice President Vance, and it turned into a shouting match. That never happens in international diplomacy. I mean, it's been in my career, which spans coming on 50 years, I have never seen anything like it. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that and my reflections over this past weekend. I also want to talk about where I think NATO is at the moment. And there was a very important summit meeting in the UK today. Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, hosted it. So I want to talk about the future of NATO as I see it in the context of really the Europeans now having to step forward and take on the burden of guaranteeing security for Ukraine. We can talk about that and how you think that's going to work, or how I think that's going to work. And I'm sure some of you will have some doubts, but I'm happy to talk about that because I think that's where we're heading. But I also want to remind us, and this will be the middle portion of my talk, about how far Ukraine has come through these 3 years of conflict and how effectively it has defended itself from the onslaughts of Russian aggression. So let's handle each of those three topics. I'll try to finish up in about 25 minutes and leave a good amount of time for questions and discussion. And I look forward to those of you online adding your questions to our discussion. I will sit down during that portion, so I hope I can move the chair so I can see both the audience here and also those of you online. We'll try that and see what happens. But I can't stand up for a full hour and a half because I've been chasing my grandsons today. I'm sure many of you have had that experience, and that's why I'm late. I'm sorry I got here a bit late, but they've been with us all weekend. We actually had a great crab cioppino on Saturday night. Has anybody here had crab cioppino before of you? Yeah, and my husband's Italian American, so he made some at home yesterday with the help of our son. It was delicious, but chasing grandsons is a little tiring. But anyway, let's start with the situation after this. It's tumultuous, I said. That's a nice way of putting it. It was terrible from the perspective of international diplomacy, because normally, and people do shout at each other behind closed doors. I've been in many a meeting when there have been sharp words between international leaders, including famously the summit meeting in June of 2018, when Trump came to NATO headquarters. I was the NATO Deputy Secretary General. My boss was Jens Stoltenberg, now back working as the finance minister in Norway, and Norway's lucky to have him. He's really a very excellent leader. But on that occasion, Trump came to the summit meeting, and everybody was kind of relieved because he was, the first day of the summit meeting, he was in a good mood and he was talking to everybody and he was laughing and kind of relaxed. So we were all like, phew. Then the second day of the meeting, we had a meeting. This is so ironic. It was a meeting of the NATO Ukraine Council. And so at the time, it wasn't Zelensky at that time, but the then president of Ukraine was in the room. And it was a meeting of the NATO Ukraine Council. And Trump comes in, he storms in late, and he begins to berate the NATO allies for not spending 2% of their GDP on defense. He was right. He was right to be scolding them because they had promised in 2014, when Russia first invaded Ukraine, taking over Crimea, they had promised by 2024 to spend 2% of GDP on defense. But then by 2018, there were only 3 countries in NATO spending 2% of GDP on defense. So they were lagging way behind. And Trump was right to come into the room and scold them for not doing the right thing. But he did it in such a way that they were, the whole NATO alliance and the poor, Ukrainian president was sitting there. It was supposed to be a meeting about NATO cooperation with Ukraine, but instead it turned into a meeting about, you're not paying enough for defense. I will not agree to abide by the Article 5 security guarantee. That is, if one NATO country is attacked, then all other countries in NATO must come to its defense. That's in the Washington Treaty, the basic foundational document of NATO from 1949. So he comes into the room, yells at the NATO allies, and to this day, and this is a good example of what I'm talking about right now, Jens Stoltenberg handled it with so much finesse. He said, okay, Mr. President, we hear you. We need to talk to you quietly and privately. He looked around the room where, of course, there were many hangers-on. You have the president in the front row or the prime minister in the front row with his top aide, and behind them you have staff of all kinds, senior people, but staff of all kinds. On that occasion, Stoltenberg said, I'm clearing the room. You choose president or prime minister who you want in the room with you, but I'm clearing the room, everybody else out. And everybody else had to leave. And what ensued, and I got to stay because I was his deputy, but what ensued then was a quiet conversation, a serious conversation with Trump to talk to him about how the European leaders plan to raise their defense spending in the coming years. Afterwards, I have to say we were up in Stoltenberg's office sweating because we had no idea what was going to happen. Whether, he insisted that he wanted to go first with the first press conference. And that's very unusual. Normally, it's the Secretary General of NATO at a NATO summit who gets to have the first press conference. But Trump insisted he had to have the first press conference. So we were up in Stoltenberg's office sweating and saying, oh my God, what's he gonna say? And we have to be ready to, somehow defend NATO. So we were trying to prepare Stoltenberg with all kinds of defensive points. But Trump comes out sweeter than pie, says I got what I needed from the NATO leaders. Everything's fine. They're moving toward 2% of GDP. It's great. So I know it seems a bit ridiculous in this case because you do have to work in a particular way with Mr. Trump to, kind of bring him along with what needs to be accomplished. But the main point here, and the main point I wanted to stress for you, is it needs to be done in private. That kind of diplomacy needs to be done in private. And you can't do it in front of the press. And I don't know whose fault it was that there were so many press in the room and the cameras kept rolling and nobody said, all right, people of the press, the media, you need to leave now. You need to leave now. Normally, the press are invited into the room. You have a few, staid talking points about what the meeting's about, and then they are ushered out of the room. But instead, they stayed on and on and on and on as this argument developed. And that is one thing I don't understand. But the other thing I don't understand, this is an interesting thing to think about, and I've been reflecting on it a lot. Zelensky's first language is not English. And I think he was at a profound disadvantage in that room, in front of the press and in front, with these two guys, President Trump, Vice President Vance, who are very experienced pugilists in our media, very experienced. Some would say bullies, but they're experienced pugilists in our media. And Zelensky, as good as his English has become in the last years, and he's done very well in working with the foreign leaders, the NATO leaders, in working also with the press, But he has his talking points. He has his talking points about I need security guarantees, I need reliable help for Ukraine going for, et cetera. But if he then has to do something more subtle, like bring the temperature down in a heated exchange, it's difficult for him. And so that speaks, and I always pay profound compliments to international interpreters who interpret for top leaders in these kinds of circumstances because they are so skilled. The people I had working with me, I was the chief US negotiator for the New START treaty, and oftentimes, you know, you get in, working with the Russians is no fun. They're, you know, they're tough and they're good negotiators. They know, you know, how to get what they need. And, you know, oftentimes we'd get into these fighting, you know, sparring matches. And it was often the interpreters who could, you know, in interpreting what we were saying, it might be pretty tough in Russian or in English, but nevertheless, they'd start to bring the temperature down. That's the kind of thing good interpreters are good at doing. So first of all, I wish this exchange hadn't taken place before the world press. Second, I think it would have been better, frankly, if they were working with interpreters. It also gives each of the leaders time to think because, you know, first you listen, like I speak Russian. So first I could listen in Russian, say, okay, I hear what he's saying. That's the tough message. And then I'd hear how the interpreter delivered it in English. And I said, that's a hint as to how I go forward, how I bring the temperature down myself, you know. So they can be your ally in a negotiation like that. And I wish myself that Mr. Zelensky, and for that matter, Mr. Trump, had had the advantage of crack interpreters in that meeting. For one thing, might have helped with the press, you know, because they get so bored having to listen to interpretation going on. They don't like that one bit. So, but as we leave this little story, I want to tell you about how I'm thinking about this meeting on Friday, which was tumultuous and not at all productive from the point of view of leading to a peace process in Ukraine. I do want to say that I think it was practically unprecedented in international diplomacy and certainly in my memory, as I said, it was tumultuous and it's going to take time and concerted effort to climb back from it. And that's what I think partially this summit meeting in UK was all about today. So I'll talk about that a little bit next, because the meeting in the UK, Prime Minister Keir Starmer himself was in the Oval Office last week. And I welcome it because not only is the UK our longest ally, longest standing ally, but they were enemies, you know, 250 years ago, we fought a war with them. So for our own independence, our own American Revolution. But in a way, that's kind of a model of, I hope sounds naive to think about it now, but where we eventually could get, one would hope, with Ukraine and Russia, that they could have a stable, sound relationship going forward where security was guaranteed for Ukraine, independence and sovereignty was guaranteed for Ukraine. None of that was assured during our own revolution 250 years ago. So it's worth thinking about. It seems quite distant now, and we have other challenges to our democracy these days, but I never say never in terms of a relationship going forward between Ukraine and Russia, or Russia and NATO, Russia and the United States. Perhaps there could be a moment when we come to a sounder, stable security, economic, and political relationship once again. We will see about that. But what I really wanted to say was I thought it was admirable the way Prime Minister Starmer stepped forward along with Macron. Now, the Germans are in a weird place right now because they're in the midst of forming a government. And so Merz, the fellow who I think will step into the chancellorship, that seems to be the results of the elections that occurred last weekend. He could not be at this summit meeting today. Scholz was there, who is now a real lame duck. But nevertheless, and the other person who stepped forward, well, it's interesting that Duda, who's the president of Poland wasn't there today, but Prime Minister Tusk was there today. You may know if you're reading about Polish politics that they rub up against each other. They don't get along all the time. But both of them are speaking off the same page now, saying we must support Ukraine and continue to support Ukraine. So that is good because Duda particularly and Tusk also have very, very good working relationships with Donald Trump. You might remember Fort Trump from the first time he was in office. The Poles really laid it on thick about we're ready to support more American troops in Europe and bring them to Poland, deploy them in Poland. We'll call it Fort Trump. Well, now they're talking about resurrecting Fort Trump again. So, but that's effective in terms of messaging the US president and talking to him about what the value can be for US security, our security, of a good relationship with our allies in Europe. And that is, of course, that it's the bulwark for US security in the end of the day. That's why we have alliances both in Europe and Asia. They are a bulwark for the US security. They mean we don't have to defend ourselves at our borderline. We defend ourselves in Europe, we defend ourselves in Asia. So, but it was good to me. And that's the kind of, we had something in the alliance called the Quad. And it was always, this was the power center of the alliance. When I was there, it was the United States, Germany, UK, France, the Quad. And they met together all the time and they drove the agenda at the alliance. And particularly the United States was always prima inter pares, first among equals, no more. That's exactly the message of what Mr. Trump has been saying over the last months, but particularly since he left his candidate status and became president. He has said, we are not going to be paying as much attention to Europe, pulling plug on this notion of being first among equals in the NATO alliance and pivoting to Asia. This is not the first president who said that. It was Barack Obama in 2013 who first rolled out the notion of a pivot to Asia in order to defend against China, a rising China. But now it seems Trump is really serious about it and is saying, we are going to focus on China, period, from here on out. And you, Europeans, are responsible for your own defense. And furthermore, you're responsible for guaranteeing the security of Ukraine as we pull together a peace process and we hope a result of negotiations to end this war with Ukraine. You Europeans are responsible for security in Europe. It's not our responsibility. You do the heavy lifting. So that's why I was so interested today reading the reports right before I came over here after the grandsons left. I was reading up on the UK summit meeting. And the messages out of it were very clever. I thought Keir Starmer gave his, press conference, and it was an orderly press conference, may I say. But he said, first, Europe would do the heavy lifting. Great message back to Washington. Europe would do the heavy lifting. Second, it would be a coalition of the willing among the NATO allies, and many allies put their hands up during that meeting, including, interestingly, Canada. As you know, they've been under a bit of pressure recently to become our 51st state. But the problem with Canada has been they haven't been spending enough on their own defense. They are well under 2% of GDP on defense. And so it was a great source of frustration, again, for Democrats as well as Republicans. Canada, pay more for your own defense. And they weren't and haven't been willing to do so. But now, again, Trudeau is an outgoing Prime Minister of Canada, but he has committed that Canada would be supporting a coalition of the willing to guarantee the security of Ukraine, providing boots on the ground in Ukraine to ensure their security going forward. And of course, the message of working with the United States, we will work with the United States. We will ensure that we continue that strong alliance relationship. And he said during the course of the press conference, someone asked him if the US was an unreliable ally. He said, by no means. The US has been a reliable ally for decades and will continue to be so. Good message from Mr. Starmer. Very good message from Mr. Starmer. And then that they would keep up military aid for Ukraine. The Europeans would keep the numbers up, and they've all been pledging additional assistance to Ukraine, including all important missile defense assistance. You've seen stories even this morning of missiles, cruise missiles, continuing to rain down on Ukrainian cities from Russia. And so Starmer announced 1.9 billion euros worth of additional support to buy missile defense interceptors for Ukraine. So good messages. I thought very solid messages. And now I get asked all the time, can Europe do it on its own? We'll have to see. I was in Brussels, gosh, it seems like a year ago, but it was weekend before last. I was in Brussels. I happened to be there the week of the famous Munich Security Conference, right after Hegseth had gone to Brussels and told them all that, well, he did say the United States supports European security and the United States supports NATO, full stop. I said, great. But then he said, but Ukraine can't expect NATO membership as part of this war termination deal. Ukraine needs to, pull up its socks and not expect to resume its pre-2014 borders. We can talk about that a bit. I thought those were actually fairly nuanced messages. Well, I'll just say a word here. He was saying Ukraine can't resume its 2014 borders, i.e., it cannot have Crimea back. But the four provinces of Ukraine, the oblasts in the eastern part of Ukraine that Russia has now claimed for its own, that was part of the 2022 invasion. And, so he was, I thought, signaling that the Trump administration did not accept Putin's land grab in eastern Ukraine. So I thought there were some interesting nuances even in Hegseth's speech, but it was a tough message overall. And people were panicking when I was in Brussels 2 weeks ago. So I said, look, you need to, as many people had been saying to them, you need to stop whining and pull up your socks and get on with paying for your own defense, acquiring capabilities you don't have today, and being ready to work with the European Union and, the European institutions as a whole to bolster your own defense and to be ready to defend Ukraine and support Ukraine in a peace process. Well, we'll see how they do. But I did think that the summit meeting today was a very good one and showed strong European support for Ukraine. But also behind the scenes, every one of those leaders has called Mr. Trump in the last 24 to 48 hours. And I do think that they are serious about keeping up the relationship with the United States and making the Trump administration, President Trump and his administration, part of the peace process. As Starmer said, we cannot do it by ourselves. The United States has to be part of it. Even if we're going to do the heavy lifting, the United States has to be part of the solution. So that was a good message as well. Now, before I throw open the floor, I've already been talking a lot. Sorry, too many stories. Before I throw open the floor, I did want to remind us all, and I think I talked about this a bit last April when I was here. Ukraine has done an amazing job defending itself. We thought that, and the famous quote from Zelensky, of course, when the United States said to him, the Biden administration said to him, you're about to be invaded. We can give you and your family a ride out of the country. And on that occasion, he famously said, I don't need a ride, I need bullets. And they have done an incredible job holding their own against the Russian Federation. Of course, they've gotten a lot of military aid from the NATO allies, from the United States of America, from other allies and partners around the world, including some of our allies in Asia have been providing support to Ukraine. But it is, to me, really incredible what they've been able to accomplish, a lot with their indigenous missile capabilities. They are very skilled missileers. They used to build the intercontinental ballistic missiles for the Soviet Union in those big plants down at Dnipropetrovsk and Pavlovsk. They know about building missiles, and they've taken that indigenous knowledge and really promulgated a revolution in military affairs, the way they are using autonomous drones, missiles, cruise missiles to attack Russia, to attack infrastructure in Russia, and to defend themselves, including using some old, Soviet era missile defense capabilities, which they've really juiced up again with their own technology to perform better against these incoming really swarms of Russian cruise missiles and drones. So they've done a great job. The other thing I like to point to is the way they have driven the Russians out of the Western Black Sea. The Russians expected to maintain sea and air superiority in the Black Sea region. But as a matter of fact, with the combination of, again, their unpiloted drones and missile systems with capable air defenses, and also cleverly using proximity to NATO littoral to make sure that they have a clear kind of sea line of communication. So what has happened is they're trying to get their grain out, right? They're a big grain producer, and their government's been struggling to keep the economy going. So grain and other foodstuffs, sunflower oil and that type of thing. After this deal fell apart that the UN and Turkey negotiated to have the grain deal it was called, to have a free flow of commerce through the Black Sea, Russian and Ukrainian, that fell apart a year ago in the summer, now 18 months ago. The Ukrainians said, all right, we're going to do it on our own. I said, there's no way they can do it on their own. Well, they established an air defense zone between their main ports, like Odessa, and the Black Sea littoral of Romania. And so they had an air defense zone. They said, commercial shipping, you will be protected here. And then they had, basically said that the commercial shippers stay close to NATO shores, all the way down to the Bosporus, all the way down to Turkey. So that's Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey. And it worked. It worked. And they cooperated very effectively with the international insurance companies, saying, we will indemnify commercial ships who are coming in. We will back up the insurance that you provide. And so the international insurers said, okay. And it has worked. So they've been able to keep their commerce going. And then the best part of this is they denied the Russians the use of their naval base at Sevastopol. The whole reason Putin started the first invasion of Crimea in 2014 was he said, I am sick and tired of negotiating with the Ukrainians over access to Sevastopol. That's the main naval base, the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet. Sick and tired of it. They always nickel and dime, or not nickel and dime, ruble and, well, you know what I mean. Anyway, they're always negotiating hard. I'm sick and tired of it. By the way, this wasn't the only reason, but it was one of the reasons that he said, we need to take over Crimea. We need control of that naval base. Well, the Ukrainians very cleverly started attacking the naval base and their fleet in the area. They sunk the Moskva, the main ship of the Black Sea Fleet, within a few weeks of the start of the war, and they went on just to basically make it impossible for the Russians to operate their fleet out of Sevastopol. So they have moved to Novorossiysk, back on Russian territory. And sadly, I think sadly, for the independent country of Georgia, they are now building a naval base in Abkhazia, which is one of the provinces of Georgia that they grabbed from Georgia in 2008. So they are ensuring now that they have a naval headquarters on what should be Georgian territory in Abkhazia. So that naval base is under construction right now. So the Russians are very clever about doing that kind of thing. But I did want to say, as I wrap up this talk, that the Ukrainians have been unbelievably brave in defending their independence and sovereignty, the existence of their nation going forward. Russia's invasion is an existential threat to Ukraine. And they've also been pretty effective in certain aspects of it, and particularly when you talk about denying Russia air and sea control. And I would say Russian pilots are not flying over Ukraine. It's a missile duel. It's an unmanned missile duel. but the Ukrainians have been really effective about ensuring that the Russians cannot maintain air superiority over Ukrainian territory, and they cannot operate freely in the Black Sea. And to me, that is an accomplishment that we should remember now. In this very difficult period, I hope that we will have a peace process in the offing, and I hope it will produce a fair, sustainable peace for Ukraine. But there are a lot of questions out there. Maybe if I come next year, we'll have a happier story to tell. I will have a happier story to tell, but that's how it looks to me right at the moment. I look forward to your questions. I look forward to questions online as well. And yeah, who's going to be first?
We do have a couple of questions online. I'll just take them in the order that they were posted. First question, how long will it be before Putin takes over Ukraine?
Well, I would say never. Honestly, you know, this is a good question. It is possible that the Russians could totally defeat Ukraine, but that was the goal back in February of 2022, right? The march on Ukraine, the march on Kyiv, and seizing Kharkiv, the second major city, which is in the far northeast part of the country. So the Russians failed in their initial strategic objective. They failed to seize Kyiv and topple the Zelensky government. They had to withdraw from Kharkiv. Kharkiv still remains in Ukrainian hands to this day. So they failed in their strategic objective. And my view is that Putin's strategic objective, although he never admits it, but I think his strategic objective now has shifted from physical seizure of Ukrainian territory to essentially trying to neuter Ukraine as an independent sovereign state. He'd like to see, and frankly have nothing against Austria. I love Austria. I love going to Vienna. I think we all do. But you know, after World War II, that was kind of the situation they were in when the Soviets offered to withdraw from occupying Austria, but said Austria must remain neutral. It must not join any alliances, must not join NATO. And it must have, you know, basically an army of limited capability and capacity. Well, Austria now plays a very, very important role, serving as a bridge between East and West. Some worry its bridge role is too close and allowing too much Russian influence into Europe. But nevertheless, I think, you know, essentially Putin would like to turn Austria or Ukraine into Austria for now and evermore, not allowing it the freedom to choose its own security relationships. And Ukraine has chosen to join NATO. This is so interesting. I'll just say this. One of the reasons I think this is true, you may remember that in 2014, the Ukrainians had been saying that they wanted to sign an association agreement with the European Union. That's what started it all. There were, you know, events in 2012 and 13. The Russians tried to install their own guy in Ukraine as president. It's stuck for a while, and then he fled the country because it was the Revolution of Dignity, sometimes called the Maidan Revolution in 2012-13. The Ukrainian president fled the country, and the Ukrainians, you know, went their direction of they had to defend themselves beginning then against the Russian seizure of Crimea. But it's interesting to me that that all started because they wanted to sign an association agreement with the European Union. And this past week, Peskov, the Kremlin ambassador said, or Kremlin spokesman, and I've heard it from Putin as well, Kremlin spokesman said, oh, we have no problem. We have no problem if Ukraine joins the European Union. That's fine. We just don't want Ukraine to join NATO. So that again kind of underscored for me that they would like, you know, if they can't take over Ukraine physically, they'd like to be able to exert influence there, maybe a kind of ability to, no doubt, I should say, no doubt an ability to veto particular leaders coming in. They want to get rid of Zelensky as soon as they can. But as far as Ukraine moving to the West and having membership with the EU, they seem to be kind of okay with that now. And maybe they see it as a platform for influencing the EU if they have a kind of faithful neighbor in Ukraine. I'm speculating here, but it is interesting to me that they've changed. Initially, I thought it was this draw of Ukraine into the European system, moving to the West, that was getting under Putin's skin. But now it doesn't seem to be an economic draw that's bothering him. It's all about the security relationship and the relationship with NATO. So it's an interesting phenomenon. But in answer to the question, I don't think Putin's going to take over Ukraine completely. I just don't think that will happen. Should we do some here in the room?
Please do.
Okay, we have a question here in the room.
Thank you very much for speaking with us this evening, Academy Awards notwithstanding.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that.
That's right, and we still showed up here.
Thank you.
But the timing could not be better, really much appreciated. If I can squeeze in two questions, I would like to, in reference to what you noted, Keir Starmer's appropriate constructive messages that he's delivering. If I'm not mistaken, the German Chancellor in waiting, Merz, has said things with a very different tenor, much more skeptical of where the United States, openly skeptical of where the United States is and is likely to be. So thoughts about Germany and the alliance going forward. And the other country I'd be interested in is if you could say anything about Turkey's interesting role as a NATO member.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay.
So, to recapitulate, what's the relationship now with Germany and Turkey?
No, Germany to this whole situation.
Germany and Turkey to Ukraine.
German chancellor in waiting, respective chancellor, is saying about the United States now.
Okay, so
Yes, so the first question has to do with the relationship between the new incoming German Chancellor, Mr. Merz, and the upcoming peace process and the relationship with the United States. And the speaker quite rightly questioned whether Merz is as on board with Keir Starmer's kind of, yeah, the US is a reliable ally. We've known them for years and we've worked with them for years. He has, I would say, he has the potential at the moment, because he's not yet chancellor, to speak a little more freely. But my own view is that once one gets into an official position, you're looking for ways to come to terms with the United States. And I think that's just going to happen, because that's the reality of the situation. Yes, Europeans are going to be more on their own. They're going to have more necessity of working together with the United States, but working together first and foremost. But I do think that, frankly, he will temper his criticism, which I didn't read as all that tough. I mean, it was clearly he was expressing the views of his party and wanted to get that out there. But I do think that he will be hoping to work well with Trump when he comes into office. So that means a certain amount of diplomacy and being ready to, advance Germany's interests in every way he can and working with the United States. That will be top of mind for him, I think. Oh, by the way, I found it really interesting today preparing for this meeting, just thinking about what's going on in Germany, because normally, as one of the commentators put it, they have a very kind of deliberate pace of forming their coalitions. But one of the commentators from Der Stern, or one of the German media outlets, said, "We can't afford to be taking as much time as we usually do. We need to get the coalition together. We need to be ready to rule. We need to be ready to participate fully in this process." So I thought that was a little bit of a funny comment on the normal way that German politics work. Slow, deliberate. It can take months to form a coalition. they don't have that kind of leisure right now. So they do need to get moving, and I hope they do. Because as I said, oh, I didn't actually finish that thought, but the top four, you know, the Quad, US, UK, France, Germany, the new Quad I see forming up with the US no longer prima inter pares, but stepping back, is UK, France, Germany still, and Poland. I think that's going to be the new kind of leadership core inside NATO. We'll see if I'm right, but I think the Poles aspire to that role and would like to get there. And that might be one of the reasons that Duda and Tusk are not feuding publicly right now, because they want to be seen as a kind of reliable partner and a stable partner for other NATO allies. Now, where Turkey is concerned, Turkey obviously is a cause, looking in from the outside, it's a cause for great concern about its membership in NATO, because it seems to cozy up to Putin more and very uncooperative with NATO allies. They got into a huge shouting match with the Germans, actually, when I was serving at NATO, because that there had been a quarrel between Chancellor Merkel and Erdogan over the matter of immigration into Germany, and they'd gotten into a huge shouting match. And I won't, and unless anybody's interested, I won't go further into that story, but it resulted in a very tough relationship between Germany and Turkey during the time I was at NATO DSG. But when you ask NATO operations people, the head of ops at NATO, who's the best ally, they say the Turks, because they always put up their hand for military operations. While NATO was still in Afghanistan before President Biden withdrew the NATO allies and withdrew the United States from Afghanistan, the Turks were protecting Hamid Karzai Airport in Kabul and keeping the airport open throughout that terrible withdrawal, when it was there was so much violence, there was so much confusion and chaos. They kept the airport open and running. And even after the United States had left, they remained there and kept the operation of the airport going, while the various aid and assistance groups were leaving, sadly, one after another. They kept operating the airport. So it's that kind of high danger, high stress operation that the Turks were always ready to take on within NATO. So I count them as a reliable ally, really, from a military operational point of view. The politics are tough, but now Erdogan is offering up, and he was the guy who, back in 2022, when the Russians and the Ukrainians were willing to talk with each other, he was the guy who was convening them at that time for peace talks early in this war. And he's offered it up again. That's his message in London today was, I am willing to offer the venue for peace talks in this war. He's trusted by Putin. They have a good working relationship. He's trusted by Zelensky. They are neighbors across the Black Sea, and seems to have a pretty good relationship with Trump. So we'll see. Maybe he can serve as the venue, the focal point for peace negotiations. We'll see.
Okay,
Let's get this chair in place for
Yeah, I
you.
was just
And
gonna
then
sit here.
can you ask one of the questions from online?
Yes, the second question from online was, do you think the altercation between Trump and Vance vis-a-vis Zelensky was planned as a tactic by Trump?
That's interesting. I've heard some yeses here in the room. How many people here think it was a tactic that was planned? Oh, quite a few, actually. As an ambush, in other words. You know, I was tempted to think that myself, but I read there was a really interesting CBS News analysis of what happened afterwards. You may want to go check it out online after this meeting's over. But they, thank you. But they talked about the way there was actually a crisis meeting afterwards, after they they shooed Zelensky out of the White House. Again, this was a horrible situation, just a horrible situation. But they, apparently Rubio and Waltz, the national security advisor, asked him to leave. But then they all gathered together, including people like Susie Wiles, who is, the chief of staff, and Trump trusts her a lot. But apparently they gathered together and had a very serious conversation about how to pick up the pieces from this terrible meeting. And to me, that didn't sound like an ambush that had been planned, but perhaps it was it was not a well enough prepared meeting in terms of making sure everybody realized that they needed to have their prepared talking points for the press, and then the press needed to leave. You don't hold a diplomatic meeting in front of the press. You just don't do it. So, and maybe that could be considered an ambush because, as you remember, Trump said, has Zelensky left the room? This is going to make great television. So there's no question the president likes great television. But I don't think it was planned as an ambush because the administration at the top level, including the president, I think, seems to have had high hopes that this mineral deal and a flashy signing ceremony there in the East Room would pay dividends in terms of moving the process forward to the next stage. And one thing I did want to mention, I've forgotten to mention it so far, everybody's made much of the fact that Trump demanded in this meeting, said to Zelensky, you gotta make some concessions. You gotta make some concessions. You're not holding a strong hand. You've got weak cards. You gotta make some concessions. Okay, none of this should have been discussed in public. This is the kind of thing you talk about, if you're gonna talk tough to your opponent, you do so behind closed doors. But he did the same thing to Putin the other day. Did you see his YouTube? I saw it on YouTube. I'm not sure where he was. But he said to Putin publicly, what did he say? Putin is a tough guy. He had a particular way of talking about it. But he said to Putin, you need to make some concessions. That was 2 days ago, or 2 days prior on Wednesday. He was saying publicly to Putin, you need to make concessions. And he said, look, again to the press, I'm used to dealing with bad guys. I can handle Putin, but Putin needs to make concessions. So it's as if it's in his weird way, he's trying to get both of them off of their zero-sum approaches. They're both in a winner-take-all kind of mindset now. And that's not how you're going to get to yes in the negotiation. Both men, Putin and Zelensky, have to move off their winner-take-all approaches. And it's true, I suppose, that Putin has the stronger hand in terms of having more national resources behind him, but he's losing 1,500 men a day. And I stress men, they don't have women in their armed forces in Russia. He's losing 1,500 men a day to death or injury, casualties. And that's a heavy, heavy price to pay, although he hasn't admitted it yet. So in any event, that's where we are at the moment. But I don't think it was an ambush. Now, as I reflect on what's been written and spoken about since, but it is evident that maybe the president was hoping for maximum media advantage, and somebody should have made sure that the press were out of the room earlier than they were out of the room.
Do you have another question in the room?
We have another question from the room.
I think, oops, that's hot mic. Thanks again for speaking tonight. Really appreciate it. I'm rightly or wrongly combining together these recent events you described, plus all the tariff talk. And I wonder what your thoughts are about the status of the United States and the world at large. Because from my viewpoint, it looks like it's going downhill, but that's maybe even true for a while, actually.
Well,
Can you repeat that question?
yes, the question is, with all the talk of tariffs and other things coming out of the White House, is the status of the United States of America going downhill internationally. Um, well, all of us were born around World War II or later. I was born in 1953. And ours was the American century, right? And Trump seems to be pulling the plug on the American century. Again, this leadership role that the United States has taken since World War II to put in place the institutions we have today, whether it's the United Nations or it's the World Trade Organization or the IMF or World Bank, all of the financial, trade, political, security, NATO, all of these international institutions that have been the bulwark of peace and security and stability and economic prosperity since World War II. He's pulling the plug on them or he's pulling the plug not on the institutions per se, but he's taking the United States out of them. He's absenting the United States from them and saying, we're on your own now. We're not going to be suckers, and that's how he sees it. We're not going to be suckers anymore and pay for all this stuff, and everybody else takes advantage of us. I just don't see it that way. I don't understand that point of view. I think I can see the real advantages for the United States of America being the first among equals for so many years and really being able to drive the agenda and to drive the process around the world. So it pains me greatly when I see things happen like happened in the UN last week when the United States voted with Russia, North Korea, Sudan, etc., on this Ukraine resolution, the 24th of February, the anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine. It pained me greatly. So do I think the United States is heading in the wrong direction at the moment? My answer to that question is yes, but it's a matter of opinion.
We have a question here online, and it is, will NATO continue more or less as is if the US steps back somewhat? So will
Yeah.
they continue if the US steps back somewhat? And how will they continue?
Well, it's a question that a lot of people are asking each other. I was actually very interested. Anne Applebaum, I respect a lot. She's a tough lady and very, very knowledgeable about Russia and Eastern Europe. So she was on the news tonight. I heard her say, well, I think NATO could pull it off by themselves, can pull it off by themselves, but it's going to take some heavy lifting to do so. That's what I say. It's going to take some heavy lifting to do so because there are a number of factors here. Today, and this is actually good for US defense industry, today, the Allies are starting to pick up their defense expenditures. They're starting to spend more on their own defense. Today, 23 out of 32 NATO allies are at 2% of GDP. Remember I said in 2018, only 3 were at 2% of GDP. So in the ensuing 5 years, the numbers have really improved in terms of defense expenditures in NATO. Now, Trump would like to take credit for all of that. He took credit, I think, for getting the momentum going in the right direction. But it was actually Putin's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 that really drove them to start acquiring more in the way of their military capacity and capabilities. And most of that money is spent in the United States because the defense industries in Europe have been allowed to weaken, and they are fragmented among different, there are a couple big producers. Sweden's a big producer, Germany's a big producer, France, UK, those are all big producers, Turkey, but they're fragmented and they don't produce to the same standard all the time. Can you imagine? They're producing different types of equipment of all kinds, and The big thing about NATO is we're looking for standard equipment, so everybody across the alliance can operate the same stuff and know if somebody hands them a radio that was made in Turkey, they know how to operate it. So this is a big issue, and it's forcing NATO defense industries in Europe, again, to pull up their socks and to modernize their defense production lines and to look at acquisitions. They have a terribly, in many places, Germany is a great example. They have a terribly stultified acquisitions process. The DoD has its own problems with acquisitions, but it's a real problem in Germany. So they've got a lot of work to do to refurbish and modernize their defense industries. Oh, by the way, if they get themselves going in terms of modernization and start producing equipment in Germany, it's going to take business away from the US defense industries, the big majors in this country. And you can bet they're going to beat a path to the White House pretty quickly if they're no longer getting those big defense contracts. That's one of the things that's so ironic about Trump's insistence of Europe going its own way, because all of that money comes back to our defense companies here in the United States, or practically all of it at this point. So that's one thing they have to do. They have to get their defense industries moving. The other thing that the NATO allies depend on a lot is what are called US enablers. So it's things like ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR. Overhead intelligence and other kinds of intelligence provided to the allies to enable, again, operational success, tactical intelligence. Other enablers are things like big tankers to provide tanker support for aircraft flying in operations and things of that kind. So the allies are, if they are going to go it alone and the United States is going to pull back or send all those tankers to Asia to support operations in the Indo-Pacific, the allies are going to have to buy some different kinds of capabilities than they've had to buy in the past, because the United States provided all of that enabling capability. So there is a lot for NATO to do in terms of the hardware, but the software of the alliance is going to have to change too, the approach to leadership. And that's why I mentioned this new notion of a new quad with the UK, France, Germany, and Poland. This is going to be tough, because as much as they struggled against the United States always being the big brother and always being the first among equals. They didn't like it, and there was always a resentment against the United States. But on the other hand, we always came in with the big ideas and said, okay, Russia invaded Crimea, here's what we're going to do about it. And let's all get behind this idea. And always provided the first draft. If you've worked in business or in government, you know the power of the first draft. If you have the pen and you've got the first draft, you can often drive the agenda. And that's exactly what the United States did. So it will be a tough thing now for these four more or less co-equal competitors to figure out a new dynamic among themselves for leadership. And finally, I am interested to see, I don't think that the United States is going to withdraw from NATO, but it'll be interesting for me to see if they will be willing to, kind of step back from leadership, or if they'll just be that long-held tradition, almost an instinctual thing to continue that leadership role, despite the fact that Mr. Trump is shifting toward Asia and doesn't want to be paying attention that much to Europe anymore. I just feel like there'll be a kind of overhang from the preceding decades that will continue to play a role as well. We'll see. But my bottom line is, I think Europe can succeed in this. But I felt a little bit when I was at NATO headquarters 2 weeks ago, I felt like I said a moment ago that I said to them, stop whining and get on with it. But I felt a little bit like they were the teenagers finally being thrown out of the house by the parents. And they, after all these years of being resentful and not liking, the parents telling them what to do, they were being thrown out of the house, maybe even given the keys to their own apartment and the keys to their own car, and say, go, you're independent now, go do it. You wanted your independence, now you have it. And all of a sudden it was not something they were ready to embrace. But But I think that they can do it. We'll see how it goes.
We have another question here in the room.
I
Can you hear me?
can.
I'd like you to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's interesting where there was an election, I think, between Hillary and Trump at one time where, is that the timing that was at the time of the Crimea invasion, something around
2
that?
years later, that was the 2016 election.
Okay, so Trump had made it into the presidency. Well, I'm just curious about this president that was pushed out, that fled Ukraine. Because I believe he came back after the invasion and tried to be like loyal to Ukrainian thought patterns at the time and wasn't really sympathetic to the invasion, even though he was supposedly installed by the Soviets or something like that. And
You know,
I remember seeing him on the ground trying to become a popular person again as a warrior. So I'm just convinced that these women that are fighting to defend their country are going to be the deciding factor. Yeah.
yeah, you know, as far as I know, he is still in exile in Ukraine. I mean, in Russia. I don't think he's ever come back to Ukraine that I know of. Because he was really hated by the Ukrainians and they were so glad to see the back of him. I went to visit his palace the last time I was in Kyiv. Believe it or not, it was when I was working. I was working at NATO, and there were direct flights from Brussels to Kyiv at that point, and my son and his wife were working in Georgia for the National Democratic Institute. So we decided we would meet in Kyiv back in like 2017. And I went to visit his palace. It's unbelievable. Maybe some of you have seen films of Putin's palace down in Sochi with like the gold bathroom fixtures and all of this wealth, ostentatious wealth. And I thought, for one thing, I thought, boy, this stuff's in bad taste. It's in really bad taste. There was a room I remember of like fake not, well, they had coats of arms on the walls, but fake suits of medieval armor, like a whole room of it. And I said, what is this all about? But anyway, it was really in bad taste. But I thought to myself, now this man was spending his money, he was spending the Ukrainian people's money on excess corruption. It's major problem. And it has been a major problem in Ukraine. I will say one of the things about the Zelensky regime that I've admired is they have done their best to get a handle on corruption. And the United States has been unrelenting. Our ambassador in Ukraine, Bridget Brink, has been unrelenting in pushing the Ukrainians to address the corruption problem in that country. And I think there's been a real improvement over the last few years. Because I know a lot of people are concerned about good expenditure of the assistance we're giving Ukraine, but I'm not saying corruption has been completely vanquished from that system, but I think they are really working hard. Go ahead. Yep.
Another question. There's a lot of US personnel deployed in Europe, more than I think most Americans realize.
Right.
What is the limits of the role of the president in making just unilateral decisions about those deployments and making rapid adjustments?
That's a big worry for the Europeans now that there will.
Can you repeat the question?
The question was, what about US troops deployed in Europe? And what is the role of the president in making unilateral decisions about withdrawing them from Europe? So great question. And the Europeans are really worried now. Again, when I was in Brussels 2 weeks ago, they were saying, well, if the US withdraws down to 50,000 troops, we're about 80,000 now. If the US withdraws down to 50,000 troops, then we can take it. That's okay. But if the US drops below 50,000 troops, then we really become concerned about the US commitment to the NATO alliance. So we'll see what happens. We were at 50,000 again, before the invasion of Crimea, and then they started to come up a bit. And actually during the time Trump was in office for the first time, they came up to 60,000. And that was the era of Fort Trump and bringing them all to Poland. And they've come up since the invasion of the second invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So there is, I think, a strong commitment now, and has been. And if he decides to, again, send some of those troops to Asia, as long as it doesn't go below 50,000, the Europeans seem like they can deal with it.
Okay, we have a question here online. Again,
Yeah, so I'll just finish off. The questioner asked, is that a question he can make by himself? And yes, that's the president's prerogative.
sorry. All right, the question again is about the Friday event. Is it possible that Trump actually wanted talks with Zelensky to fail so he could blame failure to end the war, as he, by the way, had promised to do, Trump, if he could blame failure to end the war on Zelensky? In other words, Trump to extricate himself from a promise to end the war.
Well, it's tempting to think that, and I am reflecting on the history of his negotiations with Kim Jong-un in his first term in office. Remember, he was going to make a deal. He was going to make a deal with Kim Jong-un in a few short meetings, and he was going to build golf resorts in North Korea and ensure the denuclearization of Korea in the meantime. That was all going to be part of the deal. And actually, the first round, I know the people who were working on that negotiation during the first Trump term, and they said the first round went pretty well the first time they got together. And then it all fell apart in Hanoi. Again, these folks who have been working on it from the perspective of the US team, so Mr. Trump's team, they said, well, Kim Jong-un couldn't deliver. He could not deliver in Hanoi. He didn't have, they felt he didn't have the support of his military. He didn't have the support of the rest of his political actors, the main political actors, so he couldn't deliver. And at that point, Trump just walked out and walked away. And so I have been concerned about that phenomenon repeating itself in this case, that he'll just, want to wash his hands of this and say, and he said that to Zelensky on Friday, you better take this deal or we're going to walk away. You're going to be on your own fighting this thing with the Russians, and it's not going to be pretty. It's just because they did seem very prepared to sign this mineral deal, number one, and then number two, seeing, as I mentioned, the descriptions afterwards of Trump's essentially top leaders, from Waltz, the national security advisor, to Rubio, the Secretary of State, again to Susie Wiles, his chief of staff, and Vance himself, getting together afterwards, immediately after the meeting, and saying, what are we going to do to fix this thing? How do we get this back on track again? So I don't think at this moment they really wanted it to fall apart, but it's something to be worried about in future. Again, remembering the history of the DPRK negotiations. He does say he wants to get back together with Kim Jong-un again and negotiate a deal, a better deal this time around, maybe 2 golf resorts in North Korea. We'll see. I don't know. But he's been pretty clear that he has 3 foreign policy goals to begin with. The first is full implementation of the deal in Gaza. By the way, as you know, he wanted to build golf resorts there too, which is a terrible idea. But he does want to see implementation of this Gaza deal, which his team participated in, along with Biden's team. That was a great example. I was really surprised of bipartisan agreement during the transition to get the Gaza deal done, and it resulted in a successful, at least so far, some success. The second thing is peace in Ukraine. And the third thing, which is my only glimmer of hope that I'm holding on to at the moment, is he keeps talking about denuclearization. He wants to spend less money on nuclear weapons. And he has said that now several times. It was mentioned that I was the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. So also responsible for negotiating the New START treaty, the last of our strategic arms reduction treaties to remain in force. And it goes out of force next February, in less than a year at this point. So if Mr. Trump wants to go and negotiate another deal to limit and control nuclear weapons with President Putin and President Xi Jinping, I think that would be a good thing. No matter what else happens in the world, constraints on nuclear weapons are important.
Do we have more questions from the room?
Yes, we have.
Yes, we do.
Go ahead.
Do you have more questions online, Lou?
I do not at this point.
Okay, go ahead. Here.
Were you working with NATO when the Reykjavik summit with Gorbachev and Reagan took place? There was a good documentary about the whole process on TV. And I agree with you. I think that would be one step forward, no matter who does it. But I also want to ask you about the perspective put out. A lot of people have heard John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs talk about the not 1 inch of James Baker when the Berlin, Germany reunification took place. And then a lot of people have also questioned the role of Victoria Nuland during the 2 Maidan winters. And do you think that, what's the word? The NATO expansion has made it harder to make integrating into the EU without NATO membership? Is that still possible?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the question was whether I'd been around working at NATO when the Reykjavik summit occurred back in the mid-'80s between Reagan and Gorbachev. I admire that event very, very much. At the time, I was a very young expert working at the RAND Corporation. So I was in the think tank world during that era. But I very much admired the bravery of the 2 presidents because they went to that negotiation saying they were going to get rid of all ICBMs, all intercontinental ballistic missiles, and then they were going to move on to deep reductions in nuclear weapons. And this was after a period of very grave danger between the United States and USSR with, you may remember some of the stories. I think they told this in that, it is an excellent documentary. You mentioned the story of some false warnings that were coming out in the like 1983 time period when the Soviets thought we were launching a nuclear attack against them. And apparently we were very close to having them launch a retaliation without understanding that it was a mistake. It was a Norwegian sounding rocket that appeared to be an ICBM launch, and it was a mess, which is why we need to continue to work hard to cooperate to avoid accidental and unauthorized launches based on false warning. So that's another area. I think that's an area we should be working with all of the nuclear weapon states on. But yeah, that was a really world-changing event. We did not get a complete ban on ICBMs, and we did not get everything the 2 men were talking about, but we did get into some very serious and intensive negotiations that created within a few years the ban on intermediate range ground-launched missiles called the INF Treaty, and within a few additional years, the first Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START 1. So was an important moment, a really, really important moment. Now, the second question has to do with NATO enlargement. I'm reading a bit into the question, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a question I get frequently. That is it NATO's fault that Russia invaded Ukraine? Because NATO did begin to enlarge during the Clinton administration. President Clinton decided on that, but prior to Clinton coming into office, James Baker famously in a meeting with the Russians said that NATO would not expand 1 inch toward Russia. I don't know the truth or not of that. It was never part of a formal treaty or agreement, and there have been lots of books. They're really good books written, including the book by that name, Not 1 Inch, by Mary Sarote. So I recommend that if you want to read the whole story. But the main point here is whether or not you think that there were promises made. I worked for President Clinton during that era, and President Clinton had two thoughts in his head at once. It took him a while to come around to NATO enlargement. At first, he didn't think it was a good idea. And by the way, his Joint Chiefs of Staff didn't think it was a good idea to begin with. But there were some very, very serious, and important Eastern European leaders like Lech Walesa, the hero of the Polish resistance in the last years of Soviet rule, in the last years of the Warsaw Pact. He came and spoke to Clinton several times and said, you have got to enlarge NATO. And it was those kinds of interventions, mano a mano, I think, that convinced President Clinton to move forward with NATO enlargement. But the second piece of it was that Clinton was absolutely convinced that the United States should have an abiding and stable security, economic, and political relationship with Russia. The reason being, the belief was that the president held very closely that if we knitted Russia into this system, again, it's the system, remember, that we established after World War II, but if we knitted Russia into this system, then we could be at peace with them for a long time into the future. And it worked for a few years. Some of you may remember the bromance between George W. Bush and Putin. George W. Bush. Sorry, I'm sorry, I'm getting my Bushes mixed up. But George W. Bush and Putin, and it led in 2002 to Putin actually going to the Rome summit of NATO in 2002 and signing a document that's called the Rome Declaration. And NATO was already enlarging at that point. They'd already had a major enlargement and another one was coming. Signed the Rome Declaration, which launched a decade and a half of NATO-Russia cooperation. And it launched a body called the NATO-Russia Council. So Putin himself, was ready to cooperate with NATO. It all went sour after a while. And I do think some mistakes were made. The fact that the Bucharest summit statement in 2008, for example, you know that the Russians were present at that summit meeting in Bucharest, but the NATO allies went off quietly by themselves. They didn't tell Russia what they were doing. They went off quietly by themselves and made this agreement among themselves to extend NATO membership to to Ukraine, to Georgia, to Bosnia and Herzegovina. I'm forgetting the fourth at this point. But in any event, Montenegro, I guess, was the other one. In any event, they made this commitment to extend particularly to Georgia and Ukraine, and this really set Putin off. But you see, that's part of, a lot of mistakes were made. And so I'm not negating the question you ask that, wow, what happened here? But I don't think it was the original decision to enlarge NATO, because Putin seemed, and Yeltsin, as well as Putin, seemed, they may not have liked it. At a minimum, they acquiesced, and at a maximum, in the case of Putin, he was ready to work with NATO. And by the way, I just delivered a book manuscript to the Stanford University Press. It's now under review, so I hope in a year you'll be able to read my side of the story. As I said, there's a lot of good books that have been written about NATO enlargement, but there haven't been so many accounts of this commitment, two thoughts at once, but this commitment and then this effort by President Clinton and President Bush to develop this abiding political, security, and economic relationship with Russia. So I hope you'll be able to get a sense of that history within about a year. We'll see. One more question, maybe?
Yeah, we have time for one more fairly quick question.
So, together you can hear me. Can you talk about this deal that Ukraine and the United States were working on that my understanding was ready to be signed for Ukraine to extract rare earth minerals and sell them to the United States? Is this deal still possible? And can you talk about, apparently Zelensky refused to sign that deal on Friday. So can you go into some detail about that situation? If it had been signed, would that help this peace process by demonstrating a closer working relationship between Ukraine and the United States?
Right. Well, definitely, I think it would have been a good step on the road to getting into a peace process, a proper peace negotiation. And it's not going to be easy, but it would have been one of the building blocks, I think, of a peace process that could be successful. As to whether they can get back to it or not, again, apparently that was one of the elements that Trump's team were trying to wrestle with so strongly on Friday after the debacle in the meeting room in the Oval Office. Apparently they said, you know, wow, we're back to square one if we can't get this deal back on the table and signed. Zelensky himself has made noises that, yeah, let's continue working on it. And Trump has kind of hinted, yeah, he said once Zelensky's ready for peace, he can come back again. But he's made noises like we need to keep this minerals deal on the table. It started out, I think, at least the accounts I read of the early drafts started out being not such a good idea for Ukraine, particularly talking about $500 billion is the kind of debt that Ukraine owed to the United States of America. The United States has provided just over, well, it's about 120 billion in total aid, not just military aid, but humanitarian assistance, economic assistance to try to keep the government going and so forth. So that's nowhere near $550 billion. So Zelensky was right to object to that, but apparently the deal that they were going to sign on Friday made no reference to $550 billion owed. And was, as I read it, a kind of setting up of a joint corporation for extracting minerals, rare earth metals in Ukraine, and apparently U.S. companies would come in and et cetera, and the monies would be paid into a joint or this fund that would then be used to reconstruct Ukraine. So as it came out toward the end of a very arduous negotiation, it seemed like it could work to help Ukraine. Whether we can get back to it or not, I don't know, but I do think that there have been enough hints around that people want to get back to it at the highest level, Zelensky and Trump, that maybe we can make it happen.
I wanted to ask a question. I didn't do this. Do you have any idea why Zelensky refused to sign this on Friday? That is my understanding.
I don't think
would not sign it.
he didn't refuse to sign it at this point. He was thrown out of the White House. They never got to the signing ceremony because of the dust up in the Oval Office, the shouting match in the Oval Office. Very unfortunate, as I said.
We're at the end of our time, and so thank you so much, Rose, for coming and sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
Okay, just as a
Thanks a lot.
reminder, we will have our fourth session.
We'll have a recording up in a couple of days, and I know that many of you will want to return again for our next session next Sunday. So we'll see you then. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure being here.
Thank you. We're stopping the recording now, and then we'll stop the Zoom. Good night, everybody.
What's the next topic?
Hold on a minute.
Lou?
The meeting on the 9th,
Yes.
I think I can answer that if you just hold on just a second.
Thank you.
Okay, so on March 9th, the topic is India between China and the West. And the discussion will be led by Dr. Sumit Ganguly, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and director of the Huntington Program on Strengthening U.S.-India Relations. He was formerly a professor in Indian cultures and civilization at Indiana University. So next week, March 9th, India between China and the West.
Thank you.
All right, good night, everybody.
Good night.